Welcome to Nonprofit Nerd Impact Unleashed. Get ready to dive into the world of nonprofit leadership and sustainability, where the passion and unstoppable dedication of those making a real impact are celebrated. With your host, Jarrett Ransom, get ready to explore inspiring stories and game changing strategies of nonprofit leaders from across the sector. In this season, we're focusing on critical management challenges that are key to the long-term success of nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit Nerd Impact Unleashed is your go-to podcast for no-nonsense, in-depth conversations with the real-life superheroes of the nonprofit sector. Get ready to unleash your inner nerdiness and learn how to navigate and overcome the challenges that help build stronger, more sustainable organizations. Now, let's dive in and harness the collective power of our nonprofit networks to create lasting change.
Hey, and welcome back to Nonprofit Nerd Impact Unleashed. I'm Jarrett Ransom, and I'm so glad you're here with us today. Today's guest is Deb Nelson, a tax partner at Eide Bailly with more than 20 years of experience working with nonprofits. Deb brings a wealth of knowledge and a practical perspective that every organization can benefit from. In our conversation, we explore what it really takes to manage cash flow in a nonprofit and why understanding your financial pulse is essential for mission success. Deb shares some common financial mistakes, and she offers guidance on how collaborative budgeting can bring greater transparency and accountability across the organization. Before we dive in, I want to give a big thank you to our season sponsor, Bloomerang. Their support helps us bring these important conversations to nonprofit leaders around the world. You are in for a valuable and insightful discussion, so let's get started. Well, hey there, and welcome. I'm so excited because today's guest, Deb Nelson, is someone that I have had the great honor of knowing for several years. I'm trying to think how many years. I want to say maybe 5, maybe more. I'm not sure, but Deb, I'm so glad that you said yes and accepted this invitation.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here on the podcast.
Yeah, I am excited. And Eide Bailly, for most of you, is probably a company name in particular that is somewhat familiar. I hope it is. It has been for me in my career. But I would love it, Deb, for you to really kick us off and start us by telling us a little bit about yourself and the role or roles, plural, because I know many of us wear a lot of hats, that you really have in this nonprofit sector.
Well, as you mentioned, Deb Nelson with Eide Bailly, and I have been with the firm more than 20 years now. It's hard to believe. Time flies when you're having fun. I think that is a very true statement. And I have been working the entire 20 plus years really supporting the nonprofit sector. I'm a tax partner, so I do focus a lot on tax compliance items. So helping organizations navigate that lovely Form 990 and all the information that goes into that. Going through tax regulations. I know we had that lovely bill that was passed this summer. And then my other role that I do at the firm is I lead our nonprofit industry group. And with that role, it's really less of a technical role. It's more of just staying on top of all of the trends, the emerging issues that are happening in the sector, and then working with our internal partners and consultants to make sure that we are going alongside our nonprofit clients and providing support as they help navigate whatever those emerging issues are.
That is a lot. And I love, because I always think of Eide Bailly as a thought partner in this space. I've been in the fundraising world in particular, I would say, 15 plus years, the nonprofit space, 20 plus. And there's a lot of moving pieces. You mentioned the 990. That's a public document in and of itself. And it's required, right, by all of us to do that.
It is. It's one of, you have to have people who like working on those because it's not probably people's favorite thing as their role in the finance area, but it's such an important document. It's available so many places and really kind of tells your story. And there's a lot of assumptions that people can make just by looking at that document.
Well, and it can be a tool. It can be a tool for good. It can be a fantastic resource. And so I want to shift us into like completely nerding out over some financial practices, some tips, some techniques, all the good things that I know your insights and expertise will bring. And there's some critical financial practices that I think every nonprofit leader should prioritize. And I'm curious what, right, those might be. If there's any that really rise to the top as some of those most critical financial practices. And really, I'm looking at this as a way to prioritize and to ensure, right, that the organization that they're working in, they're running, they're leading, maintains this healthy and sustainable
Mhm.
operations. And I mean, no one else better to answer this than you, Deb, and all the great organizations that you and Eide Bailly work with.
Well, first and foremost, to me, the most critical thing is cash flow management. If you don't have a pulse on what the cash flow is of your organization, it's just so hard to lead and to know whether you're accomplishing your mission and are you meeting those goals. So I think that is definitely one of the most critical elements for a leader in the financial space or a leader in general of nonprofits.
Right.
And I think depending on your nonprofit, cash flow can look really differently. If you have reimbursable grants where you're incurring all of these expenses up front and you're not getting paid until a later date, like having a handle on what that looks like, because, we all have it. There's some of those providers who are really timely on paying you. And then there's others who push that window and like it's going to be the last date before those funds come in. So I think
Yeah.
just knowing that and mapping it out, there's so many great tools out there now that can help you with cash flow management. It's just really critical.
Yeah, I
And
would say that's a good one. Yeah. What else do you
and
have?
kind of right in line with cash flow management, I would say is the budget. Like that is a really close second for me because a budget is an ever going process. It's not like you're ever done with it. So you start it and as you're working through it, the other thing I would say on budget is it should not be done in a vacuum. Like it should not be the responsibility of someone in your finance area to do the budget. It should be the responsibility of all of the leaders in the organization. So if you have different departments, you should be pulling those department leaders in so that they can really own their part of the budget because there's nothing worse than not having collaboration. You get to the end of the year and it's all the finger pointing of, well, you overspent, like this is why we aren't meeting budget. Like you just have to talk to each other internally as you go through that process.
I'm surprised, and you know this about me, Deb, but I serve as an interim CEO, CDO, so that development space. And when I see budgets, I am so surprised how often they are created in a vacuum. And sometimes the outsourced accountant is creating it, right? And I'm going, where did these numbers come from? And what's the historical data? And what's the narrative that goes with it? So I appreciate you sharing that. And maybe that ties us into the next question that I want to ask about the financial mistakes. Because if we're not bringing in our leadership team, and if we're not doing that, that could clearly be one of the common mistakes. But I want to ask you if there are some common mistakes, financial in particular, that you and your partner see at Eide Bailly that nonprofits are making, right? And also how we can ask these leaders to proactively avoid them. And when I say leaders, I often think like the leadership, the staff, but the board, committee members, right? Especially if it's like a finance committee and they're not necessarily all of those committee members aren't on the board. But what are some of the most common financial mistakes that you're seeing nonprofits make right now?
It does tie into that budget topic we were just talking about. And I think the most common thing I see is underestimating what it costs to actually do your programs or conduct your activities. I think oftentimes organizations aren't truly thinking about all of that overhead or indirect expenses that actually needs to get allocated across what you're doing. And if you don't do that, I don't know it's how you make good, sound financial decisions on is this program achieving what it should be? And granted, you're going to have programs that are not always going to be lead generators, adding to your bottom line, but they're so mission critical that you find other ways to subsidize them. But without knowing which programs you need to subsidize and which ones are producing, enough profit to help carry the others, it's kind of like leading the blind. You're just going through your day-to-day operations without true insight into how that affects the organization. And you mentioned it in the beginning too, sustainability. I mean, we all want to be able to say our organizations are going to be here today, tomorrow, years in the future. So having a handle on what it actually costs to run your programs is so important.
Yeah. I was talking to someone, and I work with organizations of all different sizes and in all different ways. And so the way I was working with this organization, Deb, it's still pretty new. It was formed in 2018, but they're still working on developing their programs and their board and a little bit of everything. And currently, there's really no operating budget, and the founder is still involved, getting paid a big fat goose egg, right? So my recommendation was also, we need a realistic budget. And that's great that the founder wants no paycheck, but in 5 years, 10 years, like, how will this organization be able to sustain itself? Because I don't know who else is going to take on this responsibility at also that big fat goose egg of a paycheck, right? So
Absolutely.
having that budget, having it realistic, the program numbers, as you said, like, how much does it really take to operate? Great advice. So let's avoid those mistakes. Let's lean into that and make sure we have that. You
And
shared
there's
a little.
another one that comes to
Oh
mind
yeah.
too for me, Jared. And
Okay.
that is just delayed financial reporting. I feel like
Mm,
in the sector, we've all experienced turnover in some of these key finance positions. And I've just seen so many organizations that are struggling to just close their books on a timely basis every month, and get through that reporting. And when you're sitting there as a board committee, management of the organization, and the most recent financial data you have is 3 months ago, how does that set
right.
you up for making those strategic decisions to move you where you need to go from accomplishing your goals? It's just so critical to be able to have that timely information. And I think it plays also into technology. I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
organizations have a tech stack where they're using a fraction of the capabilities of it. And so, are
That's
there
right.
opportunities to leverage that and optimize what you're doing to help you get more timely information?
That one's a good one. I'm glad you didn't let us miss it, because I think all three of those really kind of move into the next question that I want to ask. And we touched on it earlier. I'm really big on financial narrative, right? Which might sound like an oxymoron. You've got numbers and then you've got narrative. And how does that work? But I want to ask you really how nonprofit leaders can use the financial data and that narrative, right, to help make these strategic decisions while keeping their mission, front and center. And I'm thinking board members too, because as you just mentioned, if we're delayed in getting these reports and we're now making decisions on financial data that is 90 days old, right? Are we making the best strategic decisions? So, yeah, what's the best way then for nonprofit leaders to really lean in and use the financial data to make these, say, timely and strategic decisions?
Well, and data doesn't always tell the full story, right? So, your point about needing narrative to go along with that data is so important. And I think, sometimes we just get trapped with there's so much data we have and that we're collecting. What is
Yeah.
actually useful to us? I mean, you don't want to be tracking all of these different KPIs for things that aren't actually helpful and aren't helping you drive towards whatever your end goal is. So I think focusing it down and identifying those key indicators that you want to keep a pulse on throughout the year. Maybe you start with your top three or your top five. Could be in the fundraising area, it could be programmatic, it could be more operational structured, whatever it is that's going to most directly align with that strategic goal. That's what you want to track and kind of let all of the other noise and all of that other data that you have just be there and don't collect everything with unless it has a purpose.
Okay, this might be a curveball question, but I'm really curious. Do you recommend that we track that data and that's what's reported to the board, the leadership team, like throughout the year? Or do we always want to go back to the data set and say, we want to collect and report on this? And now because of seasonality, now because of, I don't know, federal changes or current events to other, funding implications, when do we go back to that data set and say, let's now pull out another piece of data?
That's a great question. And I think it, again, to me, ties all back to that budgeting process. Like you need to be
Right.
so flexible in that and really plan for several scenarios, like the good, the bad, the ugly. What is this going to look like?
Yeah.
And as you plan for that, and if those unexpected things come up, you know which levers to push and pull. And maybe you've got a set, point of data for each of those scenarios that's going to make the most sense. So if you are experiencing that through the year, you don't have to sit and plan through that again because you've already done that work. It's just going back saying, okay, this is where we're going to adapt. These are now our key performance indicators. We need to make some shifts in what we're tracking. So
Yeah,
it's
that's such a
fluid. I
good
don't know
planning.
that you can ever have like a one set fits all criteria for this. It has to be able to be flexible.
Yeah. Well, and talk about flexibility. My next question really leads us to the funding fluctuations. And you talked about this in the very, very first, as we talk of cash flow and really forecasting and looking at when the money comes in, because some funders, they might pay quickly, others might push that reimbursable to the very last minute. But my question is really around, and having the awareness that nonprofits, we are constantly facing, as you mentioned, this funding fluctuation, right? Or even some unexpected expenses. And so I'm curious if you have some strategies to share with our leaders that are listening, what we can use to prepare and to adapt with these funding fluctuations and or unexpected expenses.
It's, the hardest problem to solve, I think, in the nonprofit industry is it's usually unexpected. You can try and prepare for these scenarios, but granted, there's always going to be a surprise that comes up. And, there's been a lot of talk about diversification, trying to, spread the risk across different revenue streams. So if you're very heavy with contributed support, like have you thought about what else your organization can be doing to bring in some revenue? Because what if you lose that big grant? What if you lose that big donor? I think that's
Yeah.
a strategy, but I also think I would caution organizations to just focus on sticking to your mission. I feel like when we see those fluctuation issues, it's really easy to start chasing money to help ease kind of that gap that you might be having from a cash flow standpoint. And before you know it, you're trying to be everything to everyone, and you get stretched so thin that the strength that you had as an organization now becomes a weakness. So I think, adapting to that fluctuation, there's no number one key strategy, but I think it's having awareness and keeping mission front and center in everything that you do to figure out how to navigate through that.
I appreciate that. It makes me think of mission creep too. And I see that quite a bit. It's usually unintended, right? But I'll see funding opportunities and an organization will say, well, we do that, or we kind of do that, or we can do that, right? And so they're really
Yes.
trying to find like, where is there an opportunity for funding? Maybe that golden goose egg that we're looking for. But then it's not sustainable, or the relationship isn't, authentic, and then that money is gone. And anyway, there's so many variations and stories that I know we could lean into. I want to,
Mhm.
before we get to our closing questions, I want to ask specifically around some smaller nonprofits or maybe even some newer nonprofits. Last I checked, there's 1.8 million nonprofits registered in the US, but I know that number in and of itself, fluctuates. But many of these smaller and also newer nonprofits, Deb, like they're faced with limited resources. And I'm curious if you have
Mhm.
advice specific for these organizations that you would give them to build out, a strong financial foundation that supports their long-term impact. So again, this is specific to our smaller and newer nonprofits.
Well, the first thing that I'm going to mention is make sure you remember to file your 990. These smaller organizations that are volunteer led, that board positions change, over a couple of years, that tends to
Yeah.
be one of the biggest areas we see fall off people's radar, that no one realizes that that has to get done. And if you don't file it for 3 years in a row, you lose your tax exempt status. And it's not an inexpensive ordeal to get that back. You have to go back and apply to the IRS. You have to go back and file those returns. So, as these organizations form, I think it's important to put together almost like a compliance calendar. So, what are those key things that you have to be doing on a monthly basis just to maintain operations and maintain your status? So, are you doing your payroll filings? Are you filing, all of these random compliance items? Because oftentimes these organizations attract people because of their passion towards the mission, and the financial pieces often kind of fall off the radar if it's not someone who is really charged with that as their sole responsibility. So I think having just that awareness and that education as you're bringing new people into the organization is really important. And then I would surround yourself with really good board members, like people that you can lean on as you're trying to lead the organization, just providing kind of that North Star strategic direction as you get the organization up and going.
Yeah, such great advice. Really sound insights and wisdom. I always love nerding out with you, Deb. I really appreciate it. And I know our listeners have enjoyed the conversation as well, which brings me to where can our listeners find you, right? So learn more about you, Deb Nelson, and also Eide Bailly.
Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, out on our Eide Bailly website, we have a nonprofit landing page. You can sign up to get newsletters. We've got other great resources out there, and contact information for a lot of our great professionals that work in this space.
Great. Fantastic. And then one final question. I always like to ask this one, and I save it for the last because it's really that moment of inspiration or motivation. But I'm curious if there's a final takeaway that you would want other leaders listening to this to know. Anything you want to leave them with?
I would say the whole topic of financial literacy is a shared responsibility. So don't rely on just those people with the finance background. Don't rely on just the finance committee to be reviewing things and questioning things. It's really everyone's responsibility to have a base understanding of how an organization operates.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. And then I'm going back to that compliance calendar. Is there one that exists? Does Eide Bailly have it? I mean, where do I find this?
I know, right? It's a great thing. I am sure we have a template for that. It's something that we do suggest to clients, and obviously you have to customize it for your specific circumstances. But yes, I will see if I can get you that resource.
That's fantastic. Deb, thank you. Thank you for always saying yes. And thanks for the great work and advice and truly just, sound professionalism that you bring to our sector. We are so lucky to have you.
Well, thank you again, Jarrett, for the opportunity. It's been a fabulous partnership with you over the years.